Hello students. Today we will study about the topic liberalization. In the previous video you have studied about the need for economic reforms. This is a subtopic of your third chapter of Indian economy, economic reforms since 1991. Now when we talk about the reforms of 1991, before 1991, Government of India had adopted a restrictive policy in different fields, like in the field of industry, in the field of foreign exchange, in the field of trade, and India mainly focused upon the public sector. Private sector was existing, but it was given a secondary role. There were acts like MRTP Act 1969, which demotivated the entrepreneurs. They were serving as obstacles for establishing new industries. The performance of public sector units was also not very good. There were cases of corruption, undue delays, and efficiency. And there were a number of other reasons which we have seen in the previous video, which led to the introduction of economic crisis. And because of this crisis, India had to take loan from the World Bank. We had to take a $7 billion loans, and this loan was a tied loan. In return, we had to introduce some changes in our economy, and these changes only were termed as economic reforms or the new economic policy. So economic reforms in India was initiated in 1991 by the Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao and his then Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh. So Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Finance Minister that time. We can see what did he say just before proposing the reforms in 1991. He's starting that there is no time to lose because Indian economy was on the verge of collapse that time. Our foreign exchange reserve became very, very low. It was just $1.3 billion in June 1991, which is too low. It was not even enough to pay for 2 weeks imports. So we had to introduce these reforms. And that is why he's starting. There's no time to lose. Neither the government nor the economy can live beyond its means year after year. The room for maneuver to live on the borrowed money or time does not exist anymore. We need to expand the scope and the area for the operation of market forces. So India realized that now the time has come to open up the economy and get integrated with the rest of the world. Now the reforms which were introduced that time, they were of two kinds: stabilization reforms and structural reforms. Now stabilization reforms were short-term reforms. The purpose of these reforms was to stabilize the economy immediately, right? Like balance of payment crisis, to meet the balance of payment crisis or to check the inflation which had witnessed the double digit also. And second measure was structural measures. Now these measures were long term measures. These were called long term because these measures aimed in bringing changes in the overall structure of the economy so that the efficiency of the economy increases in the long run. And the policy of liberalization, privatization, globalization is covered under the structural measures only because this is a long-term measure. We can understand this with the help of this image also. 1991 economic reforms, they were of two kinds: structural reforms and stabilization reforms or measures. And structural reforms comprise privatization, liberalization, and globalization. So we will study about liberalization only today. There were lots of reforms or changes brought under liberalization. We will see to it today. So this new economic policy only is termed as LPG: liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So what is the meaning of liberalization? The literal meaning of liberalization means making free. So liberalization in this context means removal of unwanted restrictions from the economy in order to promote economic development. So, the meaning of liberalization means the removal of unwanted controls from the side of the government. Now, there were some reforms which were brought under liberalization. We will study all kinds of reforms which come under liberalization policy one by one, like industrial sector reforms, financial sector reforms, fiscal reforms, foreign exchange reforms, foreign trade policy reforms. We will start with the industrial sector reforms. Now, the first reform, the first change which was brought was abolition of industrial licensing. So, obtaining license to set up the industry was a very difficult task. This demotivated the entrepreneurs, demotivated the industrialists in the country. So previously private sector had to obtain license from government for starting any new venture. So in 1991 a new industrial policy was announced, and it abolished the requirement of the licensing except in case of 5 industries: first liquor, second cigarette, third defense equipments, next is industrial explosive, and the last is dangerous chemicals. So except these 5 areas, in rest of the areas license was not required. The next reform was contraction of public sector. We have seen that before 1991 the government mainly focused upon the public sector, but these public sector units were underperforming. So because of that, now it was thought that the government will contract the area or the sphere of public sector. In the new industrial policy, the number of industries reserved for public sector was reduced from 17 to 8, and in 2010-11 the number of these industries was reduced merely to 2. Now only 2 are there, that is atomic energy and railways. Next reform which was brought was de-reservation of production areas. So many production areas which earlier was reserved for only small scale industries were de-reserved, and forces of the market were allowed to determine the location of resources, because earlier the government used to give some directives. Now the market forces were allowed for that. Next, in the industrial sector reforms only, expansion of production capacity. Earlier production capacity was linked with licensing. Government decided how much to produce and whom give the license. Now freedom was there from license, and it also meant that now there will be an expansion of production capacity. What to produce, how much to produce was now a matter of producer's choice depending on market conditions. Next is freedom to import capital goods. So this policy gave freedom to the industrialists to import capital goods with a view to upgrade their technology. So we were now able to get the technology from the other countries. Permission was no longer required from the government to enter into international agreements for import of technology. So obviously if we get a better technology, we can have a better production. Next is financial sector reform. There were some reforms which were brought in the financial sector also. Now, liberalization implied a substantial shift in the role of the RBI from a regulator to a facilitator. Now, this is a very important change which was brought. Earlier, RBI, which is the apex institution in the monetary field, the role of RBI was basically of a regulator, but after these reforms, it got converted into the role of a facilitator. And now the private entry of private banks was allowed in the country, and the private banks were given freedom to decide their own rate of interest, rule of the decision making process rather than controlled by the RBI. Emergence of private banks. Liberalization has also allowed foreign institutional investors to invest in Indian financial markets. What are foreign institutional investors? These are those institutions which are established or incorporated outside India which proposes to make investments in securities in India. So they were allowed to invest their money. Next is fiscal reforms. Now, series of fiscal reforms were introduced, and even today they are going on. A series of fiscal reforms were there. Raised tax compliance and therefore the tax revenue of the government. Prior to liberalization, tax structure was highly complex. It was a very difficult job to pay the tax, and that was one of the reason people were hesitant to pay the tax, and the problem of tax evasion was there. So it was realized that if the tax paying procedure is simplified, people will be willing to pay the tax more, and this problem of tax evasion will be solved. It was also realized that moderate rate of taxes encourage people to pay the taxes. The rate of corporation tax, which was very high earlier, was also gradually reduced. So Parliament also passed a law, Goods and Service Tax Act in 2016, to simplify the procedure and to introduce a unified indirect tax system in India. This law came into effect from July 2017, and this is expected to generate additional revenue because now it creates one nation, one tax, and one market, and reduces the chances of tax evasion. The next is foreign exchange reforms. Foreign exchange reforms were initiated in 1991 with the devaluation of the Indian rupee against foreign currency. What is devaluation? Devaluation means a fall in the value of domestic currency as a result of cautious policy measure. At that time, our foreign exchange reserve stock was very low, and the condition of Indian economy was not good. So we devalued the Indian rupee that time, and it was expected to increase the supply of foreign exchange into the economy, because it was expected that after the devaluation our exports will rise. The exchange value of the Indian rupee in the international money market was left to the free play of market forces. So government intervention was not there any longer, and government allowed the market forces to come into play to decide the rates. Next is foreign trade policy reforms. So earlier we used to follow the policy of protection. Now this policy was no longer followed. Now the policy of survival of the fittest is followed. That is the policy of encouraging competition. Abolition of the import quotas on manufactured consumer goods and agricultural goods were also fully removed. So import quotas on these things were fully removed. Abolition of import licensing, except in case of goods which are not environment friendly and hazardous, were also finished. So except these two cases, import licensing was also finished. Export duties have been removed to increase the competitive position of the Indian goods in the international markets. So export duties were also eliminated so that our exports get encouraged and we can get foreign currency. This is a quotation by Manmohan Singh, Dr. Manmohan Singh. No power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come. Thank you.